If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. Maybe the most famous saying in Zen, attributed to Linchi, who comes into the Japanese tradition as a rinzai. And I assume most of us have heard that many times. And I assume that when we first heard it, it probably did have some kind of impact. What? This is Buddhism. What? Why are we being told to kill the Buddha? But equally, it's pretty much impossible to really imagine the shock of the context of that as a statement within a monastic tradition that is absolutely about belief, absolutely about reverence for the figure of our founder, Shakyamuni Buddha, and the shock of the challenge to that. And of course, Linchi was famous for using shock tactics. His favourite shock was the blow on the side of the head with the staff. This was not gentle Zen by any means. So it's supposed to come as a blow. It's supposed to come as a shock, and it's supposed to shock us out of shock us how? Shock us out of our complacency, that we know what Buddhism is, that we know what the Buddha is, that we know what the aim of our practice is. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge to what our idea of the Buddha is. And we can talk about that in terms of the specialness of the Buddha. You mere unenlightened beings, how could any idea you have of a Buddha be vaguely adequate to the marvellous reality of this? And equally, it might be seen as a caution for reliance on learning, reliance on understanding the sutras, as giving us an adequate image, experiential understanding of what a Buddha might be. But of course, all the work we've been doing over the last few months is about the inadequacy of our image, our understanding of any being. We've talked in terms of identity, of freezing, of the limitation of our knowledge, the limitation that our knowledge creates in our meeting, in the possibilities of our relationship. So actually, maybe we should say, if you meet your next door neighbour on the road, kill him, because just as much is just as marvellous, just as special, just as unique, just as exactly like you. And then maybe we should, finish the job. Let's say, if you catch sight of yourself in the mirror, kill yourself. Or maybe just smash the mirror, but the principle's the same. How could this image in any way, how could you dream this would give you understanding? Real understanding, experiential understanding. And so we talked about this in terms of identity. Yeah, this is exactly identification, this is exactly the known, this is exactly that shutting down that's potentially lurking in all of our doings, all of our understandings. And yet, how could we ever manage without it? Impossible. So, is this supposed to just reduce us to noble silence? Well, clearly I can't say anything. We talked about this in relation to identity. Well, no. This is the space in which we work, the impossible space in which we work, in which we do speak, we do relate, we do meet each other. But of course it also asks us, what is our practice about? Is it a practice of understanding, or is it a practice of action, of doing? We talked about knowing and doing a little while back. is our practice a knowing or a doing? And there's the traditional phrase, handsome is as handsome does. And it's going, well, yeah, a Buddha is as a Buddha does. Action. In this case, action as relationship. So is there a way that we can meet the Buddha in a way which doesn't involve us having to kill him or us or our neighbour or anywhere else? Well, if we're thinking in terms, we all have an identity for the Buddha. This is what we bring to it. We could actually think in terms of maybe the different identities which the Buddha's been given over the millennia and here and there. All of which in their way are perfectly correct understandings, functional understandings, yet which clearly conflict absolutely. How do we hold these? We could actually think about the traditional Buddhist concept of view, which we generally hold critically. It's a view. We shouldn't hold to it. Well, yeah, in that sense, the Buddhist idea of view is very much in the way that I've been talking about identity over the past couple of months. And one of the interesting things is that these views, these identities, provide us material for our fantasies. Our ideas, our assumptions, our preconceptions, which we kind of pick up, but we engage with some of these. So I could say, and I absolutely don't mean this, rank in order how much you engage with the following 5 views of what a Buddha is. And I picked the number 5 just because that's how many I found when I was thinking it through. So forget that, and certainly don't rank them in order. But here are some ideas, here are some views about what a Buddha is, and which do we engage with, and to what degree, and how, and why? How do we get here? So we could start with the Buddha of tradition, the Buddha of belief, where they're really important facts about the Buddha. We know about rebirth. We take that as a given, and we can wonder about exactly how that works. And we know that during the course of his enlightenment, the Buddha obtained absolute knowledge of all his past lives, leading up to the enlightenment. Okay. And we can see that makes a good sense in context, and that being a traditional Buddhist within the Theravadan or Tibetan or many other traditions absolutely believes, firm belief. Okay, that's good. Do I believe that with all my heart? Or actually am I just happy to get down on my knees, put my hands together, say the words, see what happens? That's a perfectly valid form of believing also. Maybe it gets a bit more difficult when we talk about the mystic powers of the Buddha. They're there in the suttas. They're held to be not important. They're basically just used occasionally to get people's attention. But, they're taken as real. Okay, yeah, not sure how I feel about that. How are we with the 32 marks of the Buddha, traditional marks? Golden skin, yeah, okay, we can take that as, it's a metaphor, obviously. Beautiful golden skin, fantastic. That's easy. How are we with the arms so long that his hands reach down to his knees when he walks? A little bit weird. Okay, so how are we with the tongue, which a Buddha can extend and cover his entire face with? Are we still good with this? Do we want to do something else? Is this the point where we go, not sure about this? So how far do we engage? And then what about the very different Buddha, the modern Western Buddha? Developed over the last couple of 100 years from when some of the romantic philosophers really the most notable one, got quite interested in the reports of Buddhism coming back, and slowly, over a century or so, created this image of the rational Buddha. The Buddha as philosopher. The Buddha as almost scientist, test it, try it out, experiment. Does it work? Demonstrations, good logical argument. Don't just believe this stuff. You have to see whether it works. I suppose. We can almost talk about, in that sense, the Buddha as an entrepreneur of the spirit, finding out this one individual striving through, attaining understanding, but absolutely on the basis of being a normal, if exceptional, human being. And we can begin to understand the way that Buddha, obviously fits a much more modern, contemporary worldview, and is obviously, in some senses, the antidote to Christianity, in particular, with its God. We don't need a God. We're rational. We can do this. Man is the measure of all things, as we said in the Renaissance. And the Buddha is the man that proves that. Okay? So are we happier with that? Of course, then we can come with the idea of the historical Buddha, as in, yes, we can see this was a body of teachings, and of course the Buddha talked about rebirth because that was the prevailing wisdom of the age. Obviously, times change. We can see Buddhism travels here, Buddhism travels there. Beliefs are different. And in actual fact, the way that the modern rational Buddha, the Western Buddha I've just been talking about, gets criticised by historians seems to me quite unfair, because that's exactly what every Buddhist tradition has done when it develops in a new context, in a new society. It remakes it for its own purposes. It remakes it in its own image with the materials and the understandings which it has to there. Just as the Tibetans made a Tibetan Buddhism, just as the Chinese made a Chinese Buddhism. It's just what you do. Which makes it neither true nor untrue. So are we happier with the Western Buddhism? Do we want to stick with the Buddhism of the scholars? Just say, well, yes, we can see. Don't need to decide about this. We can see it goes through, and I can believe in a certain sense, but equally not believe in a certain sense. Or the other kind of route out of, and it's worth obviously saying that it was in a sense, the historians beginning to look at Buddhism, which made the development of the modern Buddha possible, because history as a modern Western discipline didn't exist in its anything like this form outside recent Western European history. But then maybe go, well, actually, do we need any of that? Come on, it's all about practice, it's all about experience. If we're going to take this testing for ourselves business seriously, then we don't need any of that. And it's so off-putting for so many people. Let's face it, so many people arrive at Zen, Buddhism generally, as refugees from organised religion, usually Christianity, usually because of particular bad experiences with organised religion, whether that's at school or they were forced to go to church, or, equally their parents always rubbish. They would be mad to believe that. So, we don't have to believe any of that stuff. We just sit on our bums and we work out whatever we work out from what happens there. And obviously at one end of that, you get a kind of secular Zen. It's a no Buddha Buddhism. It's a Buddhism without Buddha. We just don't have to go there. We can do Zen without ever having to mention the Buddha. And at the other end of that line obviously comes what has been referred to as mindfulness, Zen as self-improvement, Buddhism as self-improvement. Yes, a leaner, fitter, smarter, more go-getting you that can cut through all the rubbish and succeed at business, which is, of course, the exact opposite of what Buddhism is about and the exact opposite of what Zen is about. But from that no Buddha Buddha, we can get to that point. Or should we go really rarefied? Deconstructionist Buddhism. As in, just as you can take a philosophical text and a philosophical system and you can go, okay, we got this and we got that. And they don't link up, do they? There's this gap here. But actually that gap isn't just an error, it's a part of the system, and it's really important in our understanding what that thing as a whole is. And you do the same to literary text. And of course, since late 70s, 80s, that's been a really important way of working within philosophy, within literature studies. We can do the same with Buddhism. And that sounds, okay, that's going to, surely that's going way over the top. But actually, I think here, for once, it's a really useful strategy. Look, I'll take one of the absolutely basic things within Buddhism. Let's go back to the idea of rebirth. Yes, we have a chain of states of related being. I hesitate to call them incarnations because, it's not reincarnation, it's rebirth. And these are somehow linked on a personal line. And yet, we know, if we know anything about emptiness, we know that that just doesn't work. Okay, so we've got a square and a circle and we need to get them to fit together. And of course, each tradition, many times different ways within each tradition, we try and bring these two together. And they sort of work and they sort of don't. And sometimes people go away entirely satisfied, and sometimes people go, that's just not it. And we can look at the reasons why that is so. We can just hold this fundamental difference and sit with these gaps in the awareness of this tension, because, and this is what's interesting in an ordinary mind sense, I think, it's that business of resistance again, which Joko talks about. Where are we made uncomfortable? Where do we feel that tension within our own response to things? This is exactly where our own fantasy, our own, what Diane Rossetto calls requirements of the situation, are coming in. And in a sense, all we're doing with this is just finding those points of meaningful not working, meaningful contradiction, meaningful tying in knots, and just allowing ourselves to sit with them. Neither belief nor disbelief, nor uncertainty. And in terms of rebirth, if you talk to Barry about it, you're just asking the wrong question. Maybe that's somewhere we'd like to travel at some point. And in a sense, it's one of the least interesting questions you can ask. But because if we reach that point of just open, not knowing, with this resistance, with this, oh yes, I can see that. Oh no, I don't respond to that at all. Oh, I find that quite inviting. Oh, I find that really off-putting. And just sit and work with that. We're working with our tradition, we're connecting with our tradition, but we're also working with the multitude, the multiplicity that is ourselves in our different received opinions, assumptions, fantasies, the way that we make sense of this tradition in a way that is, well, it's not knowing. It's potentially open, it's potentially creative, it's potentially relationship. So we might actually ask, well, okay, relationship, how might that work? And I will go back to Thich Nhat Hanh here, as so many times, talks about, when you're experiencing difficulty in life, hand it to the Buddha. Does that require me to believe in the Buddha as a separate being? Is this just a space within myself where I can park things? Do I even need to ask that question? At its simplest, it's the idea of offering to another. Or when we bow, and again, bowing. Ooh, maybe we're really into bowing. Maybe, just, I do it, but what are we bowing as? What are we bowing to? And we can think about that in different senses as well. We can go, oh yes, one bow for the Buddha, one bow for the Dharma, one bow for the Sangha. But when we're offering bows to each other on sesshin, I was just thinking about this earlier. That's fantastic. It works in Zoom, doesn't it, as well? Look, I'm bowing to myself. Look, I'm bowing to all of you, the Sangha, individually and collectively. But what am I bowing to? My imaginary identity of you? The Buddha in you? You as Buddha? You as this wonderful, incredible, already enlightened being? Well, and is that just going to be a form of words? Or is there a meeting here? And how does that feel? And what shape does that meeting have? And is it a potential to explore this relationship? What can that tell me about me? I don't mean in an understanding sense, just in the sense in which we sit with things. Where does that lead? How does that feel? The question we keep coming back to, what is it to be the Buddha of this place? What is it to see 12 Buddhas looking back at me on the screen? Comes back to emptiness as not separate. Can we understand the Buddha as both like me and not like me, as not separate, in a way that doesn't just reduce us to blandness, the blandness of one? Oh yes, we're all Buddhas, that's just fine. Well, it's obviously not. We'd like to accept that notion. We do resist that notion. Always. Of course we do. Partly because we have ideas about what a Buddha is. Partly because we have ideas about what we are. We're stuck in these identities. If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. But we can actually turn that on its head too, in terms of relationship. If you want to see a Buddha, just look in the mirror. Let's sit.